Hello and welcome to the Copilot Studio today, Copilot background breakout. My name's Fiore. I'm a technology strategist with Lantern Studios. I've been in the industry for more years than I care to admit. I started out in consulting, took what I jokingly refer to as a brief 14-year break at Microsoft, ended up working there far longer than I thought it would be when I started, and then went back to my roots in consulting. We're going to go over a few things in the next 30 minutes. First, we'll level set on what AI is and how we got here. We'll go over the different types of copilots and how they're categorized. We'll talk a little bit about Copilot for M365 and drill down a little bit on how it works under the covers. We'll then go over 3 different case studies of how Lantern worked with other organizations to help generate impactful AI solutions. And then we also have a few things that are typical potential next steps when you're done with the Copilot Studio in a day. To start with, AI is a fundamental change in how businesses work. You can see the statistic about 93% of businesses are either using or planning to use AI in the next year. One of the reasons for this is that AI is what's classified as a general purpose technology. If we go back and you can look at the railroad, wasn't created to deliver one type of cargo to a specific customer. It was created to deliver all types of cargo to all customers. And in a similar way, when electricity was introduced to America, it was wired into all businesses and all households and could run anything that was electronic inside those. This is the nature of a general purpose technology, and AI is in the same position of being able to impact all businesses, having an impact on a wide variety of different use cases, and also being able to have impacts at the consumer level as well. So this is not a passing fad. It's not a trend. It's not the next blockchain. It really is the next internet or the next smartphone. It's also important to remember that AI is not new by any stretch of the imagination. Back in the 1950s, the original research on artificial intelligence was started. By the 90s, we were into machine learning. By the 2000s, we were into deep learning. And generative AI is just the latest evolution of a technology that's been going on for 70 years. And it's important also to think about the fact that there are still dozens of subfields of AI that are being worked on at this moment that are all working towards this idea of a general purpose AI. Virtually all the AI technologies that we have today are special purpose AIs that are designed to solve a specific type of problem. The idea is ultimately to get to a general purpose AI that thinks and learns and makes decisions like a human. But that's my best guess, probably at least a couple of decades away. To zoom in on where we are today, there are really 3 major kinds of AI that are most commonly used today. Those are predictive, prescriptive, and generative. Predictive and prescriptive have a lot of similarities. They're both about collecting large sets of data and training models and validating those models. And the idea is to identify patterns and trends in those models to be able to make predictions or to be able to identify potential solutions, i.e., prescribe. And some of the technologies under the covers are more traditional machine learning and predictive analytics and game theory and things like that. Generative AI is a little different in the sense that it's designed to generate content that looks like it was created by a human. Most folks are familiar with large language models. Term that you're starting to hear more and more of is small language models. And these are basically language models that are optimized for small computing footprint. For instance, if you have a model that needs to be run on a laptop or a tablet that's disconnected from the internet, small language models are designed to be almost as good as large language models, but with a fraction of the computing horsepower needed. Generative adversarial networks is a term that you may or may not run into. This is actually a component of most large language models. And it's basically the idea that there's a generating network that creates the content, and then there's an adversarial network that sort of checks it to make sure that it looks like a human wrote it. And those two go back and forth. So if the adversarial network decides that the generative network didn't do a good enough job, it can send the generative network back to redo the problem and come back with a different solution. Variational autoencoders are probably useful to know about in the sense that in Copilot Studio, in the prompt settings, there is a heat slider. And the idea is you can slide in one direction and have the prompt results be more predictable. And if you slide to the other end, the results become more creative. So if you're writing a work of fiction, you want maximum creativity. If you're prescribing medicine, you probably want minimum creativity. And these variational autoencoders is basically a technology that allows you to adjust the number of variations and randomness that the model is willing to tolerate so that, again, you could introduce more creativity or less creativity. To talk about where businesses are with this, Microsoft did a study a couple of years ago. I believe it was something like 1,300 organizations that were involved, and they were basically classified in terms of what they had done, how much they had done, what kinds of impacts they were getting from the work that they had done. And it resulted in this sort of AI maturity model where most organizations are either exploring, planning, implementing, scaling, or realizing. If you do some quick math, you can see at the bottom of this slide that 75% of organizations are in the first three stages, despite the fact that in those last two stages, where 25% of organizations are, that's where organizations are seeing either 61 or 96% value on the investment that they've made. Lantern's mission is to help organizations move from left to right across the spectrum. So if you're at exploring, we want to help get you to planning and implementing. If you're at scaling, we want to help get you to realizing. But our goal is to work with you wherever you are in this maturity model and help you move forward so that you could start realizing the most value possible from the investments that you make in AI. Lantern has also started looking at AI through the CEO lens, and that's the idea of looking at what are the opportunities to apply AI to the customer experience to drive revenue and growth? What are the opportunities to apply it to the employee experience, typically to improve productivity? And what are the opportunities to apply it to the operational experience, typically about efficiency and profitability? There's some case studies at the bottom that we're actually going to go in detail to a little later in the case study section. But those are examples map out where those case studies fit within the CEO framework. So another thing that the industry has come to realize is that AI really needs to be business value driven. There was a quote from someone at Microsoft, and I'm going to paraphrase, that we really shouldn't be saying, how do we apply AI to the business? What we should be doing is flipping that around and saying, what are our biggest business challenges today? And which of those business challenges are going to benefit the most from AI? And typically that comes down to looking at those business challenges and defining use cases, and then looking at which of those use cases is going to drive the highest business value. Another really glaring example of this is when Microsoft launched Copilot for M365, the first few organizations tended to roll it out to everybody in their organization, and often without a lot of organizational change management and adoption, without any training tricks and evangelism and all of those things that go with a good technology rollout. What Microsoft has done now is taken a slightly different approach to say, let's look at use cases. And if you look at the Microsoft materials now, they're very use case driven. They offer a few dozen different kinds of use cases and different scenarios. And the idea is really businesses that are getting the most value of this are saying, let's look at the business case, let's understand the value drivers, and then let's create a solution that specifically maps to that, which is perfect for Copilot Studio for reasons that I'll get into in just a minute. The other thing that's really important is technical readiness. Now, when we're talking about something like predictive and prescriptive, this is typically about data cleansing. It's about making sure you have enough data, which is a big problem for predictive and prescriptive, and also making sure that the data is relatively clean in the sense of having consistency in how it refers to things and similar timescales if you're connecting different data sets, things like that. There's an equivalent to that for generative AI, where it's typically about looking at all of your unstructured data, all of the documents in your organization, and making sure things like access controls and security and document classification, things like that are applied. So it's important when you're getting ready to roll out one of these technologies to do a little bit of technology assessment and make sure that you're going to get the results. We actually saw in the early days of Copilot for M365 where folks would get too many and begin to question if maybe some of that information the user shouldn't have access to. And on the other side, there were some organizations that the answers didn't have enough information and they knew that the user should have access to some information that wasn't showing up. So a big part of the technical readiness is again, looking at some of those foundational ideas around governance and access and security and making sure that those things are prepared for and set up correctly to benefit from whatever AI solution you're applying on top of. So let's talk a minute about some of the different kinds of copilots. This is the wheel of Copilot, and this is probably at least a year old at this point. So I think there's something like 85 on here now, and I'm sure there's a lot more. But these are basically all of the product copilots. And inside of those 85 plus different kinds of copilots, they really break down into these three different categories. There are product copilots, and M365, Copilot for M365 is an example of that. Other examples are Copilot for GitHub or security or Excel. The plus side of these are that they have a lot of functionality built in that's specific to the product that you're in. So there are Copilot features in Copilot for Excel that you won't find in Copilot for Outlook and vice versa. The generative AI and the large language models are optimized for the specific types of tasks that each of these products can do. In the middle of this, you have extending copilots. This is typically where you see Copilot Studio come in, where built on top of Copilot for M365, you're connecting to other line of business systems or introducing some business logic or having a long running Copilot through automation or something like that. Again, taking in a product Copilot and adding some functionality to extend it and enhance what it can do to allow some customization. And then on the far right of this are custom copilots. This is basically from scratch custom coding and using something like Azure AI Foundry, where you have maximum flexibility. Pretty much you can do almost anything if you have the right skills and enough time and enough money. You can create these. And Microsoft has even started referring to Copilot as a part of the stack. So just like you have identity and you have data and you have business logic and you have user interface, Microsoft is starting to talk about Copilot as part of that stack in the same sense that those other technologies are. Let's talk a little bit about Copilot for M365. What makes Copilot for M365 different from most large language models is, yes, it starts with the large language model. But in addition to the large language model, it uses your data in the form of Microsoft Graph. I'll talk more about Microsoft Graph in a minute, but at the highest level, this is basically everything that's in M365. Every email that you've ever sent or received, every message that you've posted to Teams, every document that you've opened, every meeting that you've attended, all of that information is stored in Microsoft Graph. And the other thing that's a little unique is the fact that Copilot is embedded into these Microsoft 365 apps. So when you're in Microsoft Word, you don't have to go out to a website and run your prompt and get your answer and cut and paste it in. You can actually run the prompt directly in the product and have it put the result directly in the product. For Word, that might not be as big of a jump, but when you're talking about something like Excel or PowerPoint, it's much more efficient to be able to operate, to access the large language model from within the tool that you're already working in. So to talk a little bit of Microsoft Graph, I mentioned in the first slide, it's grounded in your data. It is your data. The other thing is it's reflective of your security and permissions. So if you don't have access to something, it will not show up when you send a prompt to Copilot. For those of you that are familiar with SharePoint, there used to be something called security trimming, where SharePoint would make sure that if you did a search, you never got a result back that you didn't have access to. You would never get a result back that you could click on and it would say access denied or request permission. Those things that you didn't have access to wouldn't show up. And Copilot basically uses Microsoft Graph to do the same thing. It trims out and only allows you to see answers for data that you have access to. The next important thing about Microsoft Graph is it's not used for large language model training. If you're using any consumer large language model, every prompt that you do and every response that you get back is kept by the large language model and used in the next iteration of learning to improve the model. That unfortunately can often result in some issues. In the early days of ChatGPT, there was a company whose name I won't mention, who basically had a developer part of source code to be able to ask questions about it. And unfortunately, that source code then became part of the next model's training. And this developer inadvertently exposed intellectual property of his company and made it publicly available. So again, it's important to understand that your data will not be used. There is zero potential that your data will end up in a large language model outside of your organization. And the last thing is the semantic index. This is basically within Microsoft Graph. Microsoft has a sort of network that understands this meeting and this document and this instant message are all related to each other in some way, so that when a Copilot prompt goes into Microsoft Graph, it can connect everything about the question and package it, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. So I have two versions of this slide. Both slides talk about how Copilot works. This one is more for folks that are audio learners. And then the next slide is for folks that are more visual learners. But the idea here is that there's this process that when you send a prompt to Copilot, it takes that prompt, it sends it to Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph collects all of the information that might potentially be related to this prompt and packages it up. So something that's referred to as retrieval augmented generation or grounding. And it takes all of that and sends it back to Copilot. Copilot takes this package with the prompt and the most likely relevant information for that prompt and sends it off to the large language model where it does what a large language model does. And then that sends the result back to Copilot. Copilot then sends it back down to Graph for post processing, where it verifies to make sure that there's nothing in the response that the user doesn't already have access to. And when it's done with that, it goes back to Copilot and Copilot returns it to whichever application was requesting in the first place. Again, just visualize that a little bit. You've got Copilot in the upper left-hand corner, sending through the prompt to Copilot in the middle. Copilot goes down to Microsoft Graph, collects all that information, packages it up so that it goes back through Copilot to the large language model. And again, when the large language model sends it back to Copilot, it sends it back down into the Microsoft Graph to do that post processing before it sends back out to the app that called it. What's a little different in the visual version that's not in the text version is this idea that you can connect out through plugins or through things like Dataverse or Power Platform services so that you get additional things that are involved in the grounding. And this is typically where Copilot Studio comes in. That's most often what you're using to define a data source that's outside of Microsoft Graph. But that connector basically allows it to include those results in the same way that it would include other Microsoft Graph results. Security is a topic that comes up pretty much every time we talk about Copilot, even though we've talked about some of these things today already, reinforce them a little bit. The first is none of your data is used for large language model training. There's zero possibility that your information is going to be exposed to the public or to any organization outside of your own. The next is data doesn't leave your M365 service boundary. This is related, but as the idea is everything that you do with Copilot operates within your service boundary. Nothing is accessible to any other organization. And again, nothing is used for learning outside of your organization. The next item on here is the idea that Copilot obeys your Microsoft 365 permissions model. This gets back to the technical readiness that we talked about earlier. All of the security and governance and classifications that you've created in M365, Copilot obeys and follows all of those things. And the last item is Purview. If you're not familiar with Purview, this is basically a governance framework, a governance technology that Microsoft has available that covers things like data loss prevention and document sensitivity. Again, Copilot for M365 through Graph leverages all of these things as part of the solution. So let's talk about some case studies. This first one is for Unify. If you're not familiar with them, they're a airport services company. They do everything from load fuel on planes to load cargo on planes to provide wheelchairs on the ramp, all of those different services that are related to everything except plane and the airlines, basically. They had an issue that they came to Lantern with where they wanted to be able to better predict when safety incidents were going to occur. Safety evidences are extremely expensive. The example that they gave us was if we have a baggage cart and its brakes haven't been properly maintained and a high wind event happens and it breaks free from a tether and hits a plane, it doesn't just do millions of dollars of damage to that plane. That plane has to go out for service, which means another plane needs to go in, which means flights need to get rescheduled, which means potentially people end up being put up in hotels. So this sort of snowball effect makes even a potentially small incident cost millions or tens of millions of dollars. So the work we did with them basically looked at multiple internal data sources using a more predictive analytics approach, as well as some external data sources. So they ended up with a model that they could run, and it would say something like, on Wednesday in Atlanta, there's going to be high winds and you have employees that have had a lot of overtime and you have a manager that has been on duty for less than 6 months. Those are all indicative of a safety event. And then humans could come in and look at that and say, we probably need to put a high weather plan in place on Wednesday in Atlanta. We probably need to bring in a second manager that's potentially experienced the high wind event before. And maybe we need to be really careful about the staffing so that we don't have people not show up because they're overworked. The end result of this, within the first 6 months, they saw a 20% decrease in their number of safety incidents. And on a human level, our executive sponsor was a senior VP. When he commissioned us and brought us in for this project, he came back to us later and was very happy to announce that he'd been promoted to the chief safety officer for Unify. He actually credited the work that was done as one of the things that differentiated from his peers that were competing for the same position. This case study is about a leading greeting card designer, not at liberty to say exactly who it is, but they saw the writing on the wall and said, if you can use generative AI to create words and you can use generative AI to create pictures, could you use generative AI to create greeting cards? This was more of a generative AI kind of approach, and we basically did a proof of concept with them. The interesting thing about this is they have a 28-stage quality control process. So when human beings write pictures and words and put those in a card, it goes through this 28-stage process to determine if it's going to generate the emotional connection that the company wants between the consumer and the company. And so we ran, I can't remember if it was 500 or something like that of these AI generated greeting cards. And just to give you an idea of what this is, you could go in and say, I want an anniversary card that has the color purple and includes snowmen. And it would create a card like that. So it would be highly personalized to the person that you're giving it to. After we created these and ran them through, I think it was 82% of them went through this quality process and emerged as successful. And that was within a few percentage points of the human contributions. So the other noteworthy thing about this is often a large company waits for a small company to disrupt the industry. This is a great example of a large company disrupting itself, figuring out how this transformational technology could impact their business so that they could get ahead of it and figure out if they wanted to productize it or take some other action to make sure that they were leading in the industry and not chasing a smaller disruptor. This last one is for a leading research university. They had a slightly different challenge. They had done a lot of work with generative AI, but when it came to that technical readiness, they realized that there was a lot of information that people were going to need that wasn't in their unstructured document repository. So we worked with them to develop something that ultimately became called the Lantern Loader. And the idea was when they open up their generative AI tool, they could not just ask a question, but they could say, here's 3 documents that I think might be useful to answer this question. And it didn't just use those documents to answer the question, it actually loaded them into a central repository. And it did some of that technical readiness to them. It basically looked at this leading research university, had healthcare information. So there were HIPAA implications and personal identifiable information implications, as well as more traditional kind of security concerns and access concerns around some folks shouldn't have access to certain kinds of documents. So the Lantern loader basically applied all of those things to the documents so that not only were they used for the one prompt, but then they were available to other users. Last time we checked with them, I think there were 12 peer reviewed articles that listed this particular system as a source. And also interesting was the fact that they have 5 different applications now that are using this as an engine to include this sort of functionality within another business system. Next steps. So we typically run into folks that come out of the Copilot Studio today and say, I want to do something, but I'm not sure what. And for them, we have this unlocking business value with copilots. This is typically a half day kind of session where we start with what are challenges in your industry and work down through what are some potential solutions for those, and then work down through what is the impact and effort for those different solutions, and ultimately end up with a roadmap. One of the things that customers really like about this is we actually use AI to help come up with the AI roadmap. We run a prompt to identify industry challenges. And then you should, with any good generative AI, we then apply human intelligence on top of that. Someone at Microsoft described generative AI as an eager and intelligent intern that you want to give them work to do, but you also want to check their work and coach them if they don't give you exactly the result that you expected. In these workshops, again, we run the prompt and then we get together as a group and talk about, are there any challenges for your organization that didn't come out of the AI generated results? And are there any of the AI generated results that aren't applicable to you for one reason or another? So then we end up with a more refined set of challenges. And then we run those challenges through the next sequence and the next until we end up generating this roadmap. The other type of user that comes out of Copilot Studio today is an organization that says, we want to jump in, we want to start doing something right away, we want to start building some momentum and delivering some value. And that's what this quick start was created to address. It's designed to be a 2 to 4 week engagement. It actually starts with a very similar version of the workshop that I mentioned on the previous slide. But at the end of that workshop, where we ended up with the roadmap for this particular quick start engagement, we try and figure out a good use case that we can build in 2 to 4 weeks. And then we work with the customer to build it. And the idea is you can start delivering value in 2 to 4 weeks. You can start overcoming some inertia and building some momentum. And then you can start building some excitement around doing use case 2, 3, 4, and 5. Again, there's a lot of knowledge transfer that's involved in this. So if you feel comfortable, you can go off and build 2, 3, 4, and 5 on your own. Or if you'd Lantern can help build out some of those use cases until you get the wind in your sails and feel like you're ready to build them on your own. And this last option is not Copilot specific, but we do have a more general version of the workshop that I mentioned a minute ago. And this looks at all types of AI, generative, prescriptive, predictive, et cetera. Very similar process, but again, a little broader in the sense that it includes any kind of artificial intelligence technology and not just Copilot in particular. And with that, I'd like to thank you for attending and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.